So did it feel good to make Spirit of Eden?
Yeah, well, that was very much for me. That was kind of like, oh, you know, that was kind of like the ambition in a way. Although I couldn't say, you know, at the point we did the first album, I thought at some point we'll make that album. It's at the point when we made it, it was kind of like, okay, you know, with this album, this is what we've been trying to get to.
In 1986, Talk Talk released The Colour of Spring. It was their most commercial album to date. It spanned the hit single Life Is What You Make It. Most bands would try and follow up a hit album with another hit album, but Talk Talk did a complete 180. They made a record that at the time was deemed as a commercial failure, but as the years have gone by, it has been seen by many as their greatest album. So let's see how this masterpiece came to be. If you listen to the first Talk Talk album, The Party's Over, and then fast forward to their last album, Laughingstock, Talk Talk seem like a completely different band. And in many ways, this is true. The first album had writing credits from all the band members, including at the time Simon Brenner, while Talk Talk's final album, Laughingstock, has writing credits solely by Markhollis and Tim Freescreen. By their last record, Talk Talk was basically a Tim Freescreen, Markhollis project. If we go back to The Party's Over, you would be remiss to think that Mark had an interest in synth pop, but the truth is he spoke of his love for music such as John Coltrane, Claude Debussy, Miles Davis and more. Mark's brother Ed was a big influence on what Mark listened to. He had a big collection and was 3 years older than Mark. Mark said, I mean, his collection is extremely extensive. And what he does is just sort of guides me into things that I should be listening to, you know? So maybe when I was 10, he started playing me Traffic stuff, you know, and The Doors and all that sort of thing. The Floyd and everything. And then he'd say, well, start listening to this. And it would be all the early blues stuff like Howling Wolf and that early Hooker and stuff. Then he'd sort of go, well, now start listening to this. And it'd be like Coltrane and Ornette Coleman, you know, and then he'd go listen to this, and it'd be like Karl Orff and, you know, Shostakovich. With Talk Talk's second album, It's My Life, there was a noticeable progression in sound and production. Tim Freescreen took over production duties. Tim started his career as a tape operator at Wessex Sound Studios in London in the mid-1970s before becoming an engineer and working with such artists as Hawkwind and The Rumour. Freescreen co-produced the second release of Thomas Dolby's The Golden Age of Wireless in 1982, which included the hit She Blinded Me With Silence. He also produced The Lion Sleeps Tonight in 1982. The use of synths were prevalent with It's My Life, but the songs had more texture to them. Such a Shame is a great example of this. Like The Party's Over, the album featured heavily with synthesizers and drum machines. Talk Talk still relied on live bass and drums, giving the songs a richer texture. Mark's vocals were recorded with the emphasis on dynamics, sometimes using minimal reverb for intimate sounds. On tracks like Such a Shame, the band used layered synth pads and experimental effects inspired by the Dice Man, reflecting randomness in the production choices. Some of the synths used were the Sequential Circuits Prophet 5, a Roland Jupiter 8, a Fairlight, and more. While the album still uses synths and drum machines, it's more of a textured kind of sound, and it's almost more organic and more atmospheric than The Party's Over. Mark didn't really like using synthesizers, but he said they used them more out of necessity due to budget constraints rather than preference. He committed that in their arrangements, they were guided by composers like Debussy, and if synthesizers didn't exist, he would be delighted. This period was kind of like a transitional period for Talk Talk because they were getting more into like atmospheric kind of sounds. In an unpublished 1984 interview with Markhollis, he talked about the band's progression from their debut album The Party's Over to It's My Life. He emphasized a desire to move beyond the confines of the new romantic movement, aiming for a sound that was more fluid, rich, and technologically sophisticated. It's with Talk Talk's third album, The Colour of Spring, that they started to incorporate more organic instruments, such as dobro on April 5th and Give It Up, played by Robbie McIntosh, soprano saxophone played by David Roach, harp played by Gaynor Sadler, organ played by Steve Winwood, who was in the band Traffic. There's also a choir on Happiness is Easy. There's a really interesting instrument used on The Colour of Spring called the variophone. Here's a clip from my podcast of an interview that I did with Tim Freescreen where he talks about the variophone. I was going to say, do you still have a variophone?
I do have a very
Oh,
I still have the original one that I played all the talks and stuff on.
Are you serious?
Yeah,
That's
I am.
brilliant.
I had two, and I sold one to John Parrish. But the problem with all variophones now, given that they were made in the early 80s, is that they have a kind of a diaphragm, which is like one of the main parts of the transducer that transmits the sound pressure from you blowing into some electrical energy. So that diaphragm that forms part of that transducer, the glue on that has now largely perished. So I don't think there are and I don't think it's a user serviceable part. I don't think there are probably any, unless they've been kept in some kind of like oxygen-free vacuum environment. I would imagine there are probably no working variophones anymore. I think mine does work, but it probably doesn't work very optimally, and I really need to get rid of it because I will never use it again. I don't think variophone is. It's too. You can't get away from talk with it. That's the problem.
Right.
In the same way that if you play a mellotron, you can't get away from King Crimson. If you play a variophone, you can't really get away from talk.
The variophone is an electronic wind instrument invented in 1975 by researchers at the University of Cologne. It synthesizes sounds using the principle of the most common brass instruments, creating sounds based on the vibration of the player's lips and breath and the resonance in a particular body. For this purpose, the instrument is played using a pipe controller, while the pitch is controlled either by the keys on the pipe itself or in later models an external keyboard. TalkTalk used the variophone on many tracks. Some of them include Happiness is Easy, Chameleon Day, April 5th. It's also on the Laughing Stock song After the Flood. There are so many interesting sounds that pop up. One that always comes to mind is at 3:40 on Living in Another World, when this dissonant chord is struck. The note hangs as the percussion plays, and then the harmonica and the rest of the musicians enter. It just makes that section all the more melodic, because before you had this dissonant piano. In my opinion, there are 3 tracks from the Colour of Spring era that might point to where TalkTalk were headed, and that is April 5th, Chameleon Day, and a B-side on the Life Is What You Make It single called It's Getting Late in the Evening. Out of the 3 of these tracks that are signposts towards Spirit of Eden, Chameleon Day might be the most similar in sound to Spirit. Chameleon Day, like Spirit of Eden, used silence as a listening device. Mark used the dynamics of his voice to great effect on the track. The song even starts in a similar way to the opening track on Spirit of Eden entitled The Rainbow. The variophone again was used in what seems to be a substitute for woodwinds or horns. With the commercial success of The Colour of Spring, TalkTalk were given an open budget for their next record from EMI. TalkTalk were given complete control over the recording process. Their manager and EMI executives were barred from the studio sessions. The studio that was chosen to record the album was Wessex Studios in London. On the 5th of September 1986, Tim Freescreen was in Wessex Studios. Phill Brown was there waiting to collect some tape copies of a record he was working on. Phill at the time was thinking of leaving the record business. Tim and Phill actually had worked together before on Tight Fit in 1982, but they'd not seen each other since that date. Phill was a big fan of the record The Colour of Spring, and as he mentioned to Tim, he would love to work on a record like that. He said it just as a passing comment. It wasn't something that he was lobbying for a job. He just said it as a passing comment. It was from this conversation that Phill received a call from Tim Freescreen asking could he meet at a pub on November 6th. They chatted for about an hour. They didn't really talk about music. but Hollis ended up getting a lift back from Phill. As Mark got out of the car, he turned to Phill and said, "So what sums up Olympic for you?"
When he kind of said, "So what sums up Olympic for you?" That's what I said, well, 1 o'clock in the morning, November 67. And he went, "Exactly, traffic." And it still has stuck with me, definitely. The vibe, the energy, and the freedom.
That December, Tim Green phoned Phill to say that they would be starting the next record in May, and they would love if he would be the engineer for it. One of the main reasons why Spirit of Eden sounds so good is because of Phill Brown. Phill started his career at Olympic Studios. He worked with many artists including Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Marley, and so much more. I suggest if you haven't read the book Are We Still Rolling by Phill, you definitely check it out because it's an excellent book. Talk Talk began recording Spirit of Eden in May of 1987. The studio that was chosen to record Spirit of Eden was Wessex Studios in London. Mark wanted to record with pre-1967 equipment. Some of the pre-1967 microphones that were used were a Neumann U67, a Neumann U48, a Shure SM57 and an AKG C12. There was a few exceptions with regards to the 1967 time frame, which was a Neumann KU100 dummy head, which is a binaural stereo microphone, some contact mics for Lee's drums, a Neumann U89 for Mark's vocals, which went through a Neve 1082 preamp with no EQ into a Fairchild compressor. The studio had a state-of-the-art SSL console, but as they didn't like the sound of it, they used the desk as a monitor. Everything was recorded to tape, which was a Studer A800. The Mitsubishi digital 32-track tape machine was used to feed headphones, monitors and other things. There was no Dolby noise reduction used on the record. The first thing they laid down was the drums, and they had Mark Ditcham as a human click track. Ditcham was in an isolated room or cupboard, as he remembers. Drummer Lee Harris would spend hours playing the drums. As Phill said, he'd been moved into a vocal booth which was cramped, hot and dark. It must have been both physically and mentally exhausting. After the drums were recorded for the record, the first tracks that were worked on was Maureen, which is Eden, and John Cope, which later appeared as a B-side to I Believe in You. At the start of recording the record, all the tracks had different names apart from Wealth. Modal, which was the intro to The Rainbow. There was Camel, which became The Rainbow. Eric, which became Desire. Norm, which became Inheritance. Eden was called Maureen, which got its working title from comic performer Maureen Lipman. And Snow in Berlin, which became I Believe in You. To create an ambience in the studio, various lights, strobe lights, and an oil projector was used during the making of Spirit of Eden. When the session musicians would come in, they would be offered a cup of tea and then taken into the studio, which was pretty much a darkened studio. The track would be played for them and they could play whatever they wanted. As there was 8 free tracks on the Mitsubishi 32-track tape machine, as the other 24 tracks had been used for the backing tracks, each musician would have a maximum of 8 passes. Mark was asked about this approach and he said, "I really wouldn't want to guide anyone, you see. I would just rather, for as long as it takes, and get whatever we can. I really am loathed to guide anyone." Here are a few of the session musicians that played on Spirit of Eden. Mark Ditcham percussion, Robbie McIntosh, dobro and 12-string guitar, Simon Edwards Mexican bass, Mark Feltham harmonica, and Nigel Kennedy on violin. When the session musicians were recording their parts, there was no niceties exchanged after the session, which led some musicians to hate the experience. But also some musicians loved it, like Mark Feltham, who said, "I think a little bit of fear about who is running the session makes respect both ways and get the best out of me. Mark was incredibly respectful of other musicians. I became a friend after the music was done." With every instrument that was recorded, there was a new setup, and every setup had to be documented, from the microphones used and the serial numbers to the positioning and distances at which things were recorded. Hugh Davis, who was an assistant to Carl Stockhausen in the mid-60s, turned up to the studio one day with his creation, the Schnoz. I think I probably said that. The Shagaisi or something, whatever. I'm so going to say that word wrong, but Sozgiz or something. After each session musician, Mark, Tim and Phill would listen to all the takes, keep what they wanted and erase what they didn't need or want. One such recording that was erased was the 25-piece choir for I Believe in You. Phill said it sounded beautiful, but Mark said it sounded too good, like the Cliff Adams singers. Can you erase it? Phill kept the recording just in case Mark changed his mind. The choir was replaced with the Chelmsford Cathedral Choir. On I Believe in You, Phill suggested that they should use a bowed guitar, which would sound good in the instrumental section. Mark said, okay then, here's a bow and a guitar, go do it. Phill said he didn't know how to play. Mark said, it's easy. You've had 20 years of watching musicians. Just move your hands around like everyone else. It's all chance. Mark laboured over the guitar sound on Desire. He said it was a bad idea to make demos ahead of going into the studio. He said, when Tim and I were writing Desire, we just spanked my guitar onto tape when we were writing. Did it down in a dismissive way. And when we went into the studio, we spent days trying to get that sound again. Something that had originally been so flippant and we couldn't get it. There you have it. No matter how bad you make something sound on a demo, there'll always be an element of it that you'll want to keep and that you'll try and get back and never be able to, so you're better off not bothering. Most of the guitar parts were played by Mark using a Gretsch Country Gentleman, but Tim Freese-Green played the riff on The Rainbow. It was played using a cheap Vox guitar put through a Vox AC30 amp and mic'd a few feet away with a condenser microphone. Tim said the riff was thieved very comprehensively from Steppenwolf's The Pusher. With regards to vocals, vocal takes were no more than 8 takes and then comped. Comped is when you take multiple vocal performances and then compile them into one performance. It's really easy to do nowadays in a DAW, but in 1987 with tape, that was time consuming. When it came to the mixing stage, few effects were used because, like all great engineers of the past, they got the sound at the source, whereas nowadays people want to fix it in the mix. But of the effects that were used on Spirit of Eden, there was an old spring reverb, an EMT echo plate and a digital delay. Spirit of Eden was mastered by Tim and Phill at Abbey Road on the 11th of March 1988. The reaction by EMI, their record label at the time, was less than enthusiastic. It is rumoured that A&R man Nick Gatfield cried when he heard the record. As there was no singles on the record, EMI decided to edit I Believe in You and release it as a single. They pressured the band into doing a video for the song also. After the video, Mark regretted doing it. He said, I really feel that was a massive mistake. I thought just by sitting there and listening and really thinking about what it was about, I could get that in my eyes. But you cannot do it. It just feels stupid. It was depressing and I wish I'd never done it. For me, Spirit of Eden is a record out of time. It was out in 1988, but sounds nothing like anything that was out in 1988. And as time has passed since then, it's getting the love it always deserved. In the next section of this video, I will be recreating, or trying to recreate, some of I Believe in You. I've done these type of recreations in the past, and the problem is YouTube seem to always give me a copyright claim on things because they're thinking that I've taken the actual recording of the song and put it in my video, whereas I've just tried to recreate sections. And who's ever deciding that, or it's AI or whatever it is, has terrible hearing, because you can clearly differentiate between my recreation and the song I'm trying to recreate. So I'm not going to put every single nuance in. The reason Spirit of Eden sounds so great is because of talk, Phill, Tim, all the session musicians involved, the studio, which is Wessex, you know, all those things, the gear that involved, the microphones, all that. So I'm not saying I can recreate that. I'm just doing this because it's kind of fun, and, you know, you're trying to get something similar, not saying that you ever get there, but you're trying to get something similar with the equipment that I have and doing it as I'm doing it, which is just a kind of bit of fun. I think it's fun. And I know some people listen to this and hate it and some people will like it. So if you hate it, that's cool. If you like it, that's cool too. Yeah. I've tried to use things that are in reach of people who would be listening to this at home. Like I have a Vox amp, but I know a lot of people don't have a Vox amp. So I've used a plugin to try and create that sound. The thing about plugins is you have to do a lot more to try and recreate the depth of something like a Vox amp. Again, not saying that you ever get there, but you're trying to get close. I would always normally use an actual amp and things like that. So I say if you have something that's more like that, an amp, use that. I've tried to capture things more at the source, like talktalk did. With the drums, you know, they're pretty much as they are. There's a little bit of EQ and reverb added because I'm in a small room. Because Spirit of Eden was recorded to tape, I have an outboard hardware tape unit, a saturation tape unit, you know, so I'm using that on the master bus. That might be probably the only thing people don't have. You can use a tape plugin. Some of them are decent. I haven't really heard anyone yet that sounds like tape. The one that is good is a free tape plugin called Chow Tape, which I'm using in the track. So that's a free one people can get. I think that's a really cool one. You can do lots of different things to try and manipulate the sound. So let's start off on the drums. I played my Ludwig kit and I had 3 mics on it. So I had an SM57 on the snare, which was getting the rim shot. I had an SM57 on the ride cymbal, and I had an AA U47 clone on the kick. With regards to EQ and stuff like that and reverb, there's a room reverb on the rim shot. There is a EQ on the rim shot too, which is at 5.19K. I'm doing 4.56 dB. So on the kick, I'm boosting 3.32 dB at 72 hertz. I'm taking 4.5 dB out at 194 hertz. I'm taking about 4 dB out at 448 hertz. And I'm adding a little bit at 6.5K, so I'm adding 4 dB at that. The ride cymbal, there's no EQ on that. There's nothing on that. That's just as it is as it is. All the drums are going to a Chow Tape plugin, which everything goes to. So it's all going through the Chow Tape plugin. And also all the drums are going to a reverb send, which is a B Reverb 2. Next, onto the guitars. I have a few guitars on this, so there's a few guitars. Again, everything's going through that reverb send, so everything's going through that reverb send. The guitars, there's a room reverb on one guitar, it's at 36.5%. I'm taking a bit of low end off, up till about 300 on one guitar. I'm adding 6 dB at 1.5K or about that 1.4. I'm adding 2 dB at 3.1K. There's another guitar, it's going through the BYOD by Chow DSP, which is the same guy that makes the Chow Tape. That Chow Tape is free, and this plugin is free too. That's only for like one little part. There's another guitar. So all these guitars are going through this stock plugin with Persona, so it's called Empire, and it's a Vox AC30. It sounded better going through my Vox, but I thought for the purpose of the video it would be easy to recreate for people, because people might have a different amp or they might not have an amp. So I had a tremolo pedal on it, and I don't know the settings because I did it late at night. I was like, oh shit, I forget settings. But anyways, there's a tremolo on it. The piano is basically just a Pianotech VST. I didn't EQ it or anything, I just left it as it is, so it's the Pianotech. There's an organ, which I don't think is on the main verses of this or main intro. Again, I didn't really EQ it. On my master bus, I'm taking out 1.27 dB at 261 hertz. I'm adding 1.21 dB at basically 1000 hertz. I'm taking out 1.21 dB at 4000 hertz, and I'm adding 0.112 dB at 10,000 hertz. I mean, that's kind of pointless, that one. Everything goes into this Sunset sound plugin, which I think is cool. I use it on my mixes. I kind of use it's very similar. The wet is at minus 16.9 dB. So it kind of just makes everything sound like it's in the same room, which I think is important when you're recording everything individually and you don't have a big room to use something like that. Then next is the Pulsar, that new tape plugin, which I liked. I was like, okay, I'll kind of use that. I'm not doing too much on that. It's basically when you open it, I'm just driving it a bit. I think I'm driving it maybe a quarter of the way. Then I'm using my outboard hardware, which is the density. I have the boom setting on, which basically gives like a mid-low bump. And then at the end of it, there's an SSL plugin. I'm hitting it about 1 dB of gain reduction. Because I'm not using compression on anything, I'm just kind of using the tape hardware, adding saturation and compression through that. And then the tape plugin, because everything's going through with the chow tape, so that's adding another bit of kind of like tape compression, you know. And yeah. So cheers to anyone who got this far. Thank you. Hope you liked the video. Yeah, it's fun doing these kind of things. It takes a long time to do them, but it's fun. There's also 2 books that I recommend people get. I've already mentioned Phill Brown's book, Are We Still Rolling? But you should also get Ben Wardle's book, A Perfect Silence. I've put links in the description below to each of these books. So thank you for listening.